What is going on, everybody? This is a collage of all different traps, mostly opening traps, most less than 10 moves, some as little as 2 moves, others as much, I think, as 13 or 14 moves is the most we go. But that finishes the trap. The trap is usually started by move 6 or 7. First couple traps we're going to cover is out the Ruy Lopez, which is e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and then bishop b5. The line continues. Knight f6, white will castle, black will bring their knight to g4, setting up the trap. If white tries to kick the knight by pushing h3, black pushes their own pawn to h5 to see if they'll fall for it. If the knight gets captured by the pawn, you go ahead and recapture, and they're already screwed at this point in time. If they move that knight because it's being attacked by the pawn, it is game over in the right person's hands. Now, if you look, there is 6 spots the knight can jump to. 4 of them are very easy, a novice can do. 2 of them are very, very, very difficult, as like checkmate in 12 difficult. We'll cover them real quickly. I have another video explaining all the different lines in the checkmate in 12. We're just going to cover the main line, one variation, and we're going to move on. Otherwise, this video is going to be way too long. If the knight jumps to e1, it'll be the easiest. It's only 4 moves for checkmate. You want to bring your queen to h4, threatening to bring your queen to either h2 or h1 for the checkmate. Now, white, to prolong it, can try to make an escape square with their king. So they move the f-pawn up 2. If they only move it up 1, they wouldn't be able to sacrifice their queen to delay the move. So when they push their f-pawn, you push your g-pawn, closing up that escape square. That pawn is now attacking f2, so the king can't move out. And if the pawn had only moved up 1, the queen would not be able to sacrifice himself or herself to delay the checkmate by 1 move. If the queen comes to h5, capture with your rook, we're good to go. And no matter what white does, let's say they try here, queen h1, checkmate does the job. And here is one of the really confusing lines. Most tutorials don't cover it because it's just so hectic. If the knight comes to h2 or g5, it's a hell of a line. Computer, there it is, checkmate 12 from here. Here's the line. Queen h4, f4, g3, rook f3, queen capture with knight on h2, king marches over f1, knight comes to d4, king goes to e1, queen captures g2, rook goes to f1, your rook goes to h1, queen comes to e2, knight captures queen on e2, rook captures your rook on h1, you bring the knight back, bishop comes to d3 to guard the e4 pawn, queen captures rook on h1, bishop blocks the check on f1, queen captures e4 with a check, king sidesteps to d1, queen comes into f3 check, and there's 2 moves. If the king moves to e1, knight captures c2 is checkmate, and if the bishop blocks instead on e2, Queen capture, bishop e2, checkmate. That's the difficult line in the fishing pole trap, and we will be moving on to the next. The next trap is called the Mortimer Trap, and it is also out of the Ruy Lopez. From the position where the bishop pins the knight, black will play knight f6, and if white closes the pawn chain with d3, that's a mental note to say that you can try springing the trap. And that brings your knight to e7, leaving your king pawn hanging. And if white gets greedy and captures your king pawn with the knight, you can spring the trap, the Mortimer Trap, by pushing c6, attacking the bishop. The bishop only has 2 squares that it can safely retreat to. If they go to a4, you can move your queen to a5 with check. And after they resolve check, you pick up the knight on e5. If the bishop tries c4, same thing. Queen a5 check. When they resolve the check, you snag the knight on e5. 2 things to take note of. If they go to c4, do not under any circumstance try pushing the b pawn to b5. Bishop's going to come into f7 with checkmate. Now, if white has some tricks up their sleeve themselves, they can try bringing the knight to c4. And if you don't know what you're doing and you just capture the bishop, knight's going to come into d6, checkmate. So this is how you take care of that. There's 2 moves. They're similar status with the computer if you let it run far enough. You can either move the knight that's in front of the king to g6, and then when white brings their bishop back to a4, you can push b5, forking the 2. Or you can try pushing d6. At first it says 1.6, like it's not quite as good, but if you let it run enough, it'll jump over 2. And same thing, if white retreats to a4, you go ahead and push b5, fork the 2. And that's the Mortimer Trap. The next trap is called the Noah's Ark Trap, and I will also show a slight variation of it. The Noah's Ark Trap is after the bishop comes in, pinning the knight, black will force the bishop to make a decision by pushing a6. And if the bishop backs up to a4, you can go ahead and close up the pawn structure by pushing d6. And if white pushes d4, trying to push d5 and attacking the knight with the pawn, what you want to do is push b5, hitting that bishop again, forcing it to b3. Once the bishop is at b3, with the pawn, not the knight, the pawn, you go ahead and capture the d4 pawn. And if white tries to reduce material, knight captured d4, your knight captures d4, and when the queen comes in to equalize out, you push c5 with c4 around the corner, trapping the light squared bishop. White has one fair attempt to get out of it, which will fail. The queen can come to d5, attacking your rook in the corner. And from here, what you can do is take your bishop and put it on e6, attacking the queen. It can technically drag this on a little more by throwing in a check on c6. That's when you just take your bishop and attack the queen again. The rook's now covered by your queen since the bishop is moved. So when you put your bishop on d7, queen's out of options. It can either go to b7 or dip out the back door, d5. And after that's played, you go ahead and push the c-pawn to c4, and that bishop is trapped. I will mention that there is a similar variation to this. When the bishop comes in, instead of kicking it right away, if you develop your kingside knight to f6 and white castles, you can do it similarly now. Black pawn a6, making it form a decision. If it backs out, push b5, kicking the bishop to b3. That's when you can close the pawn structure to d6, and if white pushes d4, you can capture it. If he captures, it's literally the same thing, only this time white does not have the option to put the queen on d5, attacking the rook in the corner. It just has to back out, find a safe square. You can push c4, and that bishop is a goner just as quickly. And this is the Nimzowitsch Trap in the Ruy. Starts off with knight coming to f6, white castles, black pushes d6, white pushes d4, black captures the e4 pawn, and white pushes d5. So black pushes a6, and white retreats the bishop to d3. Black retreats the knight to f6, and white captures the knight with the pawn on c6. Black will push the pawn to e4, forking the bishop and knight, but white slides over the rook to e1, pinning that white pawn so it can't capture. That's when black advances the d pawn to d5, and that's when white retrieves the bishop, saving it, and puts it on e2. Black captures the knight on f3 with the pawn that was on e4, and white captures the pawn on b7 with the c6 pawn. Black obviously does not want an extra queen, so they take on the pawn with their bishop, b7, and that's when the deadly checkmate happens. Bow! Nimzowitsch Trap. Comes out of the Berlin defense in the Ruy. Bishop b5, checkmate. That's a beaut too. And the next trap is out of the Neo-Arkhangelsk variation. That's a cool name, right? So after the bishop comes in, trying to pin the knight, a6 is pushed, and the bishop moves to a4. From here, black will push the bishop to c5, and white will castle. Black will develop their knight to f6, and white will push c3, looking to push d4. kicking the bishop. So preemptively, the bishop will tuck away on a7, and the rook will slide over to e1, protecting their e4 pawn. From here, the kingside knight will jump forward to g4, and that's when white will continue pushing the pawns to d4. Black's e-pawn will capture the d-pawn. White's c-pawn will capture the d-pawn. Black's knight on c6 will come in and take the pawn on d4. And white's knight will come through and kill the pawn on d4, opening up an attack on the knight with the queen. So black will move their queen to h4, looking to do some damage by bringing their queen in on the h2 pawn or f2 pawn. And if white makes the mistake of bringing their knight to f3, trying to protect that h2 pawn, it's game over. The black queen will come in to f2, attacking the king. The king will be forced to move to the corner, h1. And if you look, the king, or the black queen, is covered by the bishop on a7. So the queen can come in right on g1, giving the little white king a kiss. And it doesn't matter if white recaptures the king with the rook or the knight. Black has the awesome move, knight f2, checkmate by smother. This is, as I said, out of the Neo-Arkhangelsk variation. That's a cool fucking word. The next trap is also out of the Ruy Lopez, but this is from white's perspective. One of the top engine moves, which doesn't get played often just because it looks weird, is bishop c5. And if bishop c5 is played, what you want to do is push c3, looking to push d4. And another top engine move from here, which doesn't get played often, is pushing the pawn to f5. And you want to just go ahead and continue with your plan on controlling the center with d4 push, hitting the bishop. Black can try to capture the e-pawn with the f-pawn, attacking your knight now. Even though their black bishop is hanging, what you can do is move your knight to g5. It's protected by the bishop, and it's attacking the pawn that just captured yours on e4. And their bishop is hanging. So they usually will save their bishop, moving it to b6. And that's when you don't take the e4 pawn. You push your d pawn to d5. And if you look at this knight, the only move that makes sense other than going back to the starting square is e7. a5 doesn't work because b4 gets pushed. And if the knight does go to e7, you have the stellar move, knight e6, hitting that trapped black queen. They can't capture it with the d-pawn because it is pinned to the king by white's light-squared bishop. Another trap out of the Ruy Lopez from white's perspective is if black develops the other knight to f6, you want to go ahead and castle. The pawn on e4 is not free. Trust me, if they nab it, you can move over your rook and you'll get their e-pawn. Not here to discuss that. They will finish their pawn chain, pushing d6. And since their e-pawn's now protected, you have to protect yours. You move the rook over to e1. And if they bring their bishop over to g4, pinning your knight, you push the d pawn. And that's a poison pawn. If they take it, bad, 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 bad. Computer jumps to over 5 instantly. You push your e-pawn, and they got two choices. They can either move the knight or capture with the pawn. Let's look at both options. If they capture with the pawn, you want to go ahead and capture it with your knight, leaving your queen exposed. If they capture your queen, you want to go ahead and capture their knight on c6 with check with the rook. And they really don't have too many options. Anything they block with is going to get gobbled up. Let's say they block with the bishop. You're going to take their queen. And after they take your knight, whether it be with the king or the rook, you get their bishop, and you're going to be a minor piece up. If they don't take your queen and they decide to bring their bishop back, protecting the discover check, you want to go ahead and take the knight anyways. And when they recapture, you take it with your bishop with check, and you win the rook in the corner with the exchange. If they don't take it with the pawn and they decide to move the knight, they don't have too many good options. If they go back to the starting square, you're going to capture the d pawn with check, and they can't really block the check on the e7 square since the pawn is attacking. Their only real good option to block at least is with the bishop on e6. And if that's the case, you want to go ahead and bring your knight to d4, doubling the attack on the knight again. And regardless if they capture your pawn with the bishop or the queen, you're going to come in and hit the knight again and win the exchange, the rook in the corner, the exact same way. If they don't bring their knight to the g8 square and they try bringing it to h5, it's the same thing, only different now. When you capture the d pawn with check, they really only have that bishop again to block with. And when they block with it, now when you capture the d4 pawn, your queen is now attacking the knight. So after all the exchanges, you can pick up the knight at the end of the exchange. This is a little worse for them than the other options. And the only other squares they have are e4, which is, dumb. They'd lose it instantly. If they try going to d5, which is honestly their best option, you want to go ahead and take the pawn with check. And their best option, once again, if you look at the computer analysis, it's the only saving grace move by more than 2 points, is bishop e6. And if the knight does jump to the d5 square, you want to push c4. They can't take en passant because then they just lose the knight outright. The bishop is pinned, so it can't recapture. And then they're forced to move the knight again. And if they move it back to, let's say, f6, same thing. You come in just like before, capture the d4 pawn, and let's say they capture the d pawn here. Knight captures c6. When the bishop The B pawn captures the knight. You want to exchange first. After the exchange, whether they take it with the pawn or the bishop, then you come in with your bishop with check, and you win the rook in the corner. And last but not least, the only other option for that knight is D7. And it's same exact thing. E pawn takes B pawn. Their only saving grace move, once again, is that bishop to E6. Only this time, you want to bring your bishop to G5. And you attack the queen. So they more or less don't have any options. Like if they tried doing something dumb, like let's say they block it with the pawn, boom, they're really in trouble. What else are they gonna do? The only other move that they, and if they try moving the queen or something, here we go, rinse repeat. We've seen that before. So more or less they take the knight and they jump it back to F6. And that's when you take the knight, you come in on D4 again, and it's just the same turn of the crank. Doesn't really matter where they bring that knight to. And that is a doozy of a trap. And we have yet another trap out of the Ruy Lopez. Once the bishop comes in, pinning the knight, black moves their A pawn to A6, attacking the bishop. The bishop here will back out once to A4. The other knight now will jump to F6, and that's when white castles. The knight gets greedy and takes that pawn that we discussed is not free, but white here has some other plans to set a trap. They push the D pawn to D4. Black will push B5, hitting the bishop again, forcing it to B3. Once that happens, they push their D pawn to D5. And that's when you go ahead and capture their E pawn with your D pawn. Now, their D pawn currently is hit twice by your bishop and queen, and it's only defended once by their queen. So, a way to add a defender and be able to add a third defender by a pawn push is moving your knight to E7. Once the knight is to E7, that's when the rook can be pushed over to E1, and they triple the defense on the D pawn. And that's a free knight. You go ahead and snag it up like a Slurpee with that rook on E1, because if they are foolish and capture your rook with the D pawn, bishop take F7, check. They only have one move to capture. Once they capture, their queen is lunch meat. Queen take D8, capture. And that's a good one. And switching it back to black, pulling out the deep attacks now. Bishop comes to B4, and C3 gets pushed, kicking it back. So the bishop falls to A5. Once the bishop falls to A5, the white bishop captures the knight on C6, and black decides to capture the bishop with the D pawn. Once that happens, the knight comes in and captures the E pawn on E5. The queen comes to E7, attacking the knight. White pushes the D pawn, backing up the knight. Black tries kicking the knight by pushing F6. That's when white comes in with a check on H5. g6 is pushed. And the knight comes in and snags the g6 pawn, allowing the queen to take the e4 pawn with check. White will defend the check with bishop e3. And I will mention that this is the Alapin defense. Just throwing it out there. Once the bishop defends the check, black brings their bishop out to g4, hitting the queen. Queen falls back to h4, and that's when the black queen takes the g2 pawn. White gets greedy and takes the rook in the corner on h8, and that's checkmate and 2 for black. Queen capture h1, check. White's only move with the king is d2, and that's when the queen can come into d1 with checkmate. That is the Alapin defense, Alapin Gambit, where it doesn't go so good for white. Another Ruy Lopez trap, which this one, supposedly double digits of masters and grandmasters have fallen for this trap. Black pushes a6, bishop falls to a4, b5 gets pushed, bishop falls to b3. From here, knight gets developed to f6, and white castles. From here, d6 gets pushed, and h3 gets pushed. Bishop gets developed to e7. The c pawn gets pushed to c3. Knight falls back to b8. Pawn gets pushed to d4. Knight gets maneuvered back to d7. Rook comes over to e8. And black castles. White develops a knight to d7. And the rook comes to e8. That's when the bishop comes and gets sacrificed on f7. The white king comes and jumps the recapture on f7. And the white knight jumps to g5, checking the king. The king can't come to e6, so it's got to back out. And regardless of what square it goes to, the knight then jumps to e6, hitting the trapped queen. And as I said, multiple double-digit masters have fallen for this trap in the Ruy. And this is a famous game. Here we go. Black develops their kingside knight, f6. White castles. Said it before, this pawn is not free, but people seem to take it anyways. d4 is pushed. And if you don't believe me, look at the computer analysis. How is a pawn taken and it's still 0? Because it's not free, they get it back. E captures d, and that's when the rook comes over and attacks the knight. So the d pawn's pushed to guard the knight, and that's when the first d pawn is captured by the queen on d4. The pawn is pushed to a6, attacking the bishop, and the bishop captures the knight on c6, and the b pawn recaptures the bishop. From here, The knight jumps to g5, putting another attacker on the knight. And the queen gets brought to f6. Totally ignores it, leaving the white king hanging, and captures the knight on e4. If the black queen captures the free quote-unquote queen, that'd be game over, because the knight jumps to f6, attacking the king. It's a double check, so the king has no choice but to move, and it's got one square, d8. And that's when the rook comes to e8 with checkmate. Ain't that a beaut?